Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Executive Committee at Cosyne, I want to welcome you to the main meeting program and the beginning of the talks. Hopefully, many of you have been wandering around the GatherTown poster session and having a lot of great chats. I found it to be pretty fun and harkens back to my, Mario days when I was a kid. So again, on behalf of the Executive Committee, that's myself, Stephanie Palmer, Zach Mainin, Alex Pouget, and Tony Zador, welcome. You can find Anne-Marie Oswald and Srdjan Ostojic's welcoming remarks in the reception area and their overview of some new things we've implemented at the meeting. So please go check that out. I just wanted to give a huge thank you before we get started right now to Anne-Marie and Srdjan. Without them, this meeting wouldn't have happened, and they graciously agreed to lead the program committee again this year. And we would not have any of this platform arranged without the hard work of Tomasz Hromadka, Carlos Stein, and Leslie Weeks. If you run into them, you've probably gotten a million emails from them, but if you run into them, please thank them. They are the reason we are here and able to do this. So I want to get started right now with our first set of talks. As Anne-Marie and Srdjan noted in their welcoming remarks and opening remarks, we've done something new this year. There are no sort of senior people speaking. This is we are highlighting young junior people in computational and systems neuroscience, and I can't be more delighted to be chairing this first session on memory. So our first speaker is Jake Stroud, who's going to be talking to us about non-normal attractor dynamics in the PFC. Please take it away, Jake. And if you have questions, please enter them in Slido, not the chat. Please use Slido for questions, and we'll answer those at the end of Jake's talk.
Great, thank you very much, Stephanie. And it's wonderful to be here. And again, thank you so much to the organizers for putting on what I know is going to be another amazing Cosyne conference this year. So today I'm going to talk about non-normal attractor networks and why they're important for working memory. So let's start with a little background. Put simply, working memory is the ability to hold new information for a short period of time. Now here is an example of a classic working memory task, where a monkey has to is trained to fixate at a central point on a screen, and then a memory cue briefly appears at one of 6 locations. The monkey then has to maintain this cue location in working memory during the delay period before ultimately responds by making an ISA card to the correct location. Now, neural recordings while monkeys perform tasks such as this indicate that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a key site of working memory maintenance. For example, here I'm showing the activity of one neuron in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for each of the 6 cue conditions. We see that this neuron displays persistent activity during the delay period for the bottom stimulus, and it doesn't display persistent activity for any of the other stimuli. So it's observations such as these of selective persistent activity that indicate that the prefrontal cortex exhibits attractor-like circuit dynamics. However, most attractor models use carefully crafted unrealistic connectivity, such as the ring model I'm showing here. And they also do not capture observations of temporally dynamic neural activity that have been observed in working memory tasks. For example, even from this very same data set, we see that some neurons only respond during either the cue, delay, or response periods. And many other studies have also observed strongly dynamic neural activity in a variety of working memory tasks. And this appears to conflict with the persistent dynamics exhibited by attractor networks. Now, what I hope to show you today is that we will solve both problems at once and show that without constraints on the network connectivity, dynamically changing neural activity is not actually a nuisance for attractor models, but is in fact absolutely expected if information is loaded into working memory in the optimal way. So let's start with a typical recurrent neural network. The dynamics evolve according to the following equation, where tau is a time constant, x is the neural activity, w denotes the recurrent weight matrix, f is an input-output function, but for many of the models I'll be discussing today, it'll be a purely linear function. H denotes the transient cue inputs, which depend on the QC, and there's also typically some noise. Now, most classical attractor networks use symmetric connectivity, such as a Hopfield network, integrator models, which have this sort of Mexican hat connectivity profile, or ring or bump attractor models. Now, what I'm showing here is the activity of a symmetric attractor network in response to one cue input. I'm showing the activity of all neurons over time. And what we did here is we optimized the inputs to this network, which are actually just momentary inputs, so they're the initial conditions of the dynamics, so as to generate persistent activity. And what we see is that the network operates using pattern completion. The early neural activity strongly resembles the late delay activity, and that's how these networks typically operate. We can quantify these dynamics by training a decoder on late delay activity, which is shown by the black bar here, and we can test how well does this decoder generalize to early times. And we see that this decoder works well in the delay period, and it also generalizes quite well to the early period just after Q offset. And that's because indeed these networks perform pattern completion. Now the next thing we did is to play exactly the same game. So we optimize the inputs to these networks to generate persistent activity, but we simply drop the constraint on the network weights to be symmetric. We instead draw weights randomly from a Gaussian distribution, and we call these unconstrained networks. And what we find is that we can indeed generate persistent dynamics, but the early activity is very different from the late delay activity. So these networks are really not performing pattern completion. And we can see that quite clearly by, again, looking at the performance of a delay-trained decoder. We see that this decoder generalizes very poorly to the Q period. Now, just to provide some context, I'm now showing the decoding performance for two current models, which fall under these two classes. The first is a bump attractor model, which has symmetric weights, and the other model is a neural integrator model, which effectively has unconstrained network connectivity. But we see that both models, shown by the dashed blue lines, perform near perfect pattern completion, right? The delay-trained decoder generalizes very well to early times. So what we want to understand here is why optimal information loading in these unconstrained networks results in these dynamics. So what we did is we reduced dimensionality and complexity. So now we just study two neuron linear networks that generate persistent activity. Now, the only way for a linear network to generate persistent activity is for them to be neural integrators. So that's exactly what we did. And again, we considered two variants of these minimal models, one with symmetric weights and another with unconstrained weights. And I'm using this network illustration here because any unconstrained system can be converted into effective feed-forward pathways and recurrent self-loops. And it's these feed-forward connections which mean that an unconstrained system is mathematically non-normal. The weight matrix is non-normal. So now what I'm showing are the flow field dynamics for both models. So I'm plotting neuron 2's activity against neuron 1's activity. The arrows denote the velocity of a trajectory at any part of state space. And I'm showing two important directions in state space. The first one is the persistent mode, which is shown by the green line. And along the persistent mode, the activity remains fixed for all time. So if you see, the velocity of the arrows goes to 0 on the green line in either model. The other mode I'm showing is the most amplifying mode. And we can identify this using control theory. And this denotes directions of inputs which will evoke the largest amount of neural activity over time. And this mode points orthogonal to the flow field in these linear models. Now, importantly, these two directions are identical for the symmetric model, which we know mathematically. But in the unconstrained model here, they point relatively orthogonal to one another. Okay, so now what we're going to see is what happens in this system if we align the Q inputs with either of these two modes. So we'll start with the persistent mode. So an input drives activity along the persistent mode. And when you release the input, shown by the filled green circle, you just stay on the persistent mode. Because once you get there, you don't move for all time. Now, alternatively, if we align inputs with the amplifying mode, we obtain the same dynamics for the symmetric system because these directions are identical. But for the unconstrained system, we see this huge transient increase in neural activity. And we ultimately end up on the persistent mode with a much greater level of activity than if we simply started along the persistent mode in the first place. Now, importantly, both inputs have the same unit norm, so there's a fair comparison. So we're using the same input to the network to generate these dynamics. So to see these differences more, and finally, I'm showing the response of the system to just a random input. And a random input will always generate a smaller amount of persistent activity than if we use the most amplifying direction. So now, to see these dynamics a little more clearly, I'm plotting the dynamics over time along the persistent mode. Now, for the symmetric system, because all the eigenvectors point orthogonal to one another, we obtain no transient dynamics along the persistent mode. Okay, once you get in the persistent mode, you don't move. But for the unconstrained system, we see that for amplifying inputs, we start off strongly orthogonal to the persistent mode, but ultimately over time, we then amplify into that mode with around 4 times the level of activity than if we simply started into the persistent mode in the first place. So now we just wanted to check our intuitions from these minimal models with large networks. So we simulated networks of 1,000 neurons, again with either symmetric or weights drawn randomly from a Gaussian distribution. And we performed exactly the same analysis. And we find largely the same results, except that now a random direction will have a much smaller overlap with the persistent mode because these networks are so large. But yet again, for the unconstrained system, if inputs align with the most amplifying mode, we start off strongly orthogonal to the persistent mode, but we ultimately amplify into the persistent mode over time. So there's clearly a trade-off here, right? If you want persistent activity early, you must start there. But if you can afford some time, then it's actually best to start in the amplifying mode. So there's a sort of speed accuracy trade-off. It gets there later, but more robustly. And because the level of activity is much greater than if we simply started in the persistent mode, it's in this sense that the most amplifying direction is the optimal direction for inputs to be generated in these networks. So now what we want to do is to understand if the prefrontal cortex really uses these optimal most amplifying directions, we need to have some clear metrics that we can compare with some data. So what we did is we took these unconstrained linear integrated models and set them up just like the actual task that I showed earlier. So now we have a full queue period. And we have three key metrics that we're going to compare with data. The first metric is we train a decoder on late delay activity, which is something that I showed on my original slide. And then we test how well does that decoder generalize to early times. And we, again, are going to study this in response to inputs aligned with either the persistent, most amplifying, or just a random direction. Now, what we find for persistent inputs is that this delay trained decoder generalizes very well to the Q epoch, which is shown by the gray bar here, consistent with pattern completion dynamics. However, if inputs use the most amplifying direction, this delay trained decoder generalizes very poorly to the Q epoch. And that's because, as I showed on the previous slide, the activity in the most amplifying direction is strongly orthogonal to the persistent mode in these networks. And then finally, a random input generates some combination of the two. Now, importantly, because the most amplifying direction generates the most robust neural activity, I actually used a much lower level of noise for the random input, just so that we can do the best possible comparison for these three different types of inputs. Now, the second key metric that we used is full cross-temporal decoding. So we trained a decoder at one time point, and then tested how well does this decoder generalize to any other time. Now, if inputs use the most persistent direction, then the activity straight away moves into that persistent subspace. So a decoder straight away after Q onset, will generalize to all future times. Now, if inputs use the most amplifying direction, what we see is actually this pattern of early sequential activity, followed by more stable late delay activity. And then again, random looks like some combination of the two. Now, for our final metric, we really wanted to disentangle whether the inputs use amplifying or random, because we can see by eye they kind of look a little similar here. So what we did is we explicitly analyze whether the neural activity overlapped with the most amplifying mode in these systems. So that's what I'm showing here for our final metric. So if the inputs use the persistent mode, we see the activity initially aligns with the persistent mode in the Q epoch, and then just stays there into the delay epoch. However, if inputs use the most amplifying direction, we start in the most amplifying direction, shown by the red bar, and then we transition into the most persistent direction, right? So we get this crossover from most amplifying into most persistent. And crucially, whereas for a random input, that will now overlap by chance with either mode during the Q period, but then activity always transitions into the most persistent direction during the delay period. Okay, so using these metrics, we then compared these with some data. So we had data from 2 monkeys performing exactly this task, and the recordings were taken from dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So first, I'm showing the performance of a delay-trained decoder. Now we see that we obtained good decodability for both monkeys during the delay period, but this decoder generalizes very poorly to the Q epoch, which is just what we'd expect if inputs are using the most amplifying direction. Secondly, we look at cross-temporal decoding, and again, we find this pattern of early sequential activity followed by more stable late delay activity. And these dynamics are consistent with a variety of studies from various working memory tasks, where many people have seen sequential activity during the Q period and then more stable late delay activity. And these dynamics come under the heading of sort of dynamic coding. So hopefully what we're offering here is a normative explanation for why we observe these dynamics. And finally, for our final metric, we fitted linear dynamical systems to the actual neural recordings, and then unpack those linear dynamical systems to see if the neural activity really does use these most amplifying directions. And what we found is that for both monkeys, during the Q period, the activity does strongly align with these most amplifying modes before activity then transitions into these more persistent modes later on, which of course is just what we'd expect if the inputs are using these optimal amplifying directions. Now, finally, using the intuitions that we've gained from our linear models, we now wanted to understand what the cost function might be that PFC is optimizing. So to do that, we now trained fully nonlinear recurrent networks on the task. We used a rectified linear input-output function, and we used a categorical cross-entropy loss to train these networks. But we considered 3 variants of this cost function, and they only differ in the time period in which we apply the cost. So the first cost variant we consider is, we call it a full delay cost. So we apply this cost straight after Q offset, all the way until the go Q on the current trial. So as soon as the Q goes off, we want to be able to decode what that stimulus was. And this cost closely corresponds with that used by Valeria Máté and colleagues from a few years ago. The next cost we consider, we call it after go Q cost, and we apply the cost during the response time, so after the go Q. And this more directly corresponds with the actual motor cost that the monkeys would be using in this task. And this has been used in various studies. But finally, using the intuitions we gained from the linear models, we created this just-in-time cost. And for this cost, we apply it just before the earliest go Q and up until the go Q on the current trial. And so what that means is just before the go Q arrives, you're ready to read out that information from prefrontal cortex, just when you need to. We then performed the full sweep of analysis that I showed before, but for the sake of time, I'll just show the cross-temporal decoding. So what we find is that for the full delay cost, we obtain classical pattern completion dynamics. So a delay trained decoder generalizes very well to the Q period. For the after go Q cost, we typically obtain strongly sequential dynamics, particularly for fixed delay tasks. And then finally, for the just-in-time cost, we obtain this pattern of sequential dynamics followed by more stable late delay dynamics, consistent with what we've seen in the data. So, in summary, real neural circuits have non-normal connectivity by necessity. In non-normal attractor networks, optimal inputs are almost orthogonal to persistent states. We found evidence of optimal information loading in monkey prefrontal cortex, and this provides a normative explanation for observations of distinct Q to delay dynamics in monkey prefrontal cortex. We also found that PFC optimizes a just-in-time cost function, and something that I didn't have time to show is that these networks also appear to generalize to tasks involving distractor stimuli, so without having a blank memory delay period. Finally, I want to thank my collaborators Kei Watanabe and Takafumi Suzuki, who performed all the monkey experiments, and my supervisors Mark Stokes and Máté Lengyel. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was wonderful and has sparked a lot of questions and excitement from the audience. So I'm going to just jump right in with this. So Selman asks, how were amplifying directions identified in the the experimental data?
Right. So yes. So in the models, we use control theory, and that's clear. But in the data, we fitted linear dynamical systems to the neural activity during the Q and early delay periods. We checked that we obtained a good qualitative fit, and then with those linear models that we've now fitted, we then unpacked whether the activity actually uses those amplifying directions, which we again use control theory to identify. And then we did this in a tenfold cross-validated way to really check that that's what's happening.
Okay, thanks, Jake. There were a lot of questions along that direction. Surgeon asks a different question. Could you give more details on how exactly the unconstrained network was built?
Yeah. So we use the simplest number of assumptions. So we just sampled weights randomly from a Gaussian distribution. And we scaled the weights so that the largest real eigenvalue is exactly 1. And so they're neural integrators. And so they're just completely random networks, but so that the largest real eigenvalue is exactly 1, so that they act as integrators, so that they can generate persistent dynamics.
Excellent. We have a question from Matthias Brucklacher about the definition of optimality in the system. In what sense is information loading optimal? Are you taking that with respect to amplification or to information content?
Yes, so it's really with respect to amplification. So we're saying that it's optimal because if you want to robustly encode what the stimulus was, you want to generate the greatest level of persistent activity so that noise doesn't corrupt your signal. And the best way to do that is to use the amplifying direction, because it will always give you the greatest level of persistent activity, regardless if the network is symmetric or non-normal. And you can think of it just the way you train a decoder, like a logistic regression. You want to maximize the activity along that particular direction to most robustly decode what the stimulus was. I hope that reasonably answers that question.
Great, thanks. John Vestola asks, how might these results be affected by noise, which you touched on a little bit about adjusting noise in some of your models, but especially the noise in the neurons themselves, John asks, rather than just the input signal.
Absolutely. So it's quite similar to what I just said. So if you have noisy dynamics, which we used in most of the models here, you again would want to have the largest amount of persistent activity so that you can clearly decode what the stimulus was. And we tested this explicitly. So we trained, I believe, linear networks, but I think we also did nonlinear networks to decode the stimulus identity with noise. And we see that these networks always find, and we trained the inputs using backpropagation through time, and we find that they always utilize these most amplifying directions. So when you train a network out of the box, it really finds these amplifying directions. It doesn't use the persistent directions straight away.
Yonatan Aljadev asks, is there a numerical prescription for finding these amplifying modes in large nonlinear networks?
Yeah, this is a great question. So you can't really find them in nonlinear networks. So what you have to do is linearize. So what we have done, and we're doing some current work towards this, is linearizing the dynamics of a nonlinear network to try and understand if there's a sense of these most amplifying directions in nonlinear networks. And briefly, the intuition would be, for example, you might have discrete attractors in a nonlinear network. And so rather than just having the maximum amplification to that direction, you want to fall into that little well itself. But actually, the most amplifying directions, if you linearize the dynamics around the Q period and early delay period, you actually want to use these amplifying directions during the early times to clearly, again, separate what the stimulus identity was, but use them in such ways that you also fall into the attractor state. So there's an added constraint on them, that it might not be exactly the most amplifying one, which we see in linear networks, but some combination so that you also fall into the attractor state if it's like a discrete attractor system.
One last question, though there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm for your talk, and I encourage you to go look at Slido and maybe answer some of the other ones in the break. Zach Kilpatrick asked, did you look at variable delay tasks? In that case, he'd assume you can't just use a just-in-time objective, since the estimate needs to be ready to go at any time.
Yep, these are all amazing questions. So for the networks I trained at the end, we used variable delay periods. And for the just-in-time cost, you can think about it as you have to estimate the earliest possible go time. So you might have, let's say, 10 trials, and you can reasonably accurately estimate roughly when the earliest go time, right? You don't want to apply your cost right after Q offset. That's just way too early. So you do want to wait a little bit, but of course, you don't know exactly what the earliest go time would be, but the brain would have to somehow estimate that and then use that as its sort of earliest time that it needs to have the activity ready for.
Thanks so much, Jake. We're going to switch over to the next speaker, and I encourage you to have a lot of fun chats, maybe over even in the GatherTown space on some of these issues. Thank you, Jake. We're going to switch now from primates to rodents, and Meytar Zemer is our next speaker. So Meytar, take it away.
Just a minute. And here we go. Yep.
Wonderful. We see that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, my name is Meytar Zemer, and today I will show you results from our lab that suggest that long-term spatial memory is maintained in the presence of continuous drift in hippocampal representations. So this is a work done by Noa Sadeh in collaboration with Alon Rubin and me at the lab of Yaniv Ziv. Noa Sadeh is currently on maternity leave, so I will be presenting her work. So traditional models of memory suggest that information is encoded by neural ensembles that are active during the learning episode. Retrieval is then assumed to rely on the reactivation of the same neurons that were active during learning. And our prevailing notion in memory research is that the persistence of a specific memory relies on the stability of the activity of the neurons that were active during learning. And while this notion is consistent with experiments that have characterized neuronal stability over a relative short period of time between learning and recall, the relationship between remote memory and neural stability has remained unmeasured. And to address this, we can use time-lapse calcium imaging in freely behaving mice. And this is something we can achieve by combining miniature head-mounted microscopes with algorithms for tracking the same neurons over a long period of time. And just to give you an example of how this looks like, this is a typical example of data from our lab. In this movie, you can see the same mouse on 2 different days of the experiment while we record from his hippocampus CA1. And specifically, you can see this mouse is running back and forth on a linear track to collect a watery world at its end. And you see these individual, that we can track individual neurons, as are the 6 neurons that we marked here in colors. And below you can see where was the mouse when each of these neurons were active. So maybe by now you start to observe a pattern, and that is that these neurons are place cells, and they code for a specific location in the linear track. And place cells can serve as a very useful model system for memory, since they form an internal representation of space that is experience dependent, and their activity persists with time. Specifically, you can see that these place cells are somewhat stable across these 2 days of the experiment. So using this type of method, as a recent study have shown that hippocampal representations gradually change with time, even in a fixed familiar environment. So specifically, we can look at the map that was formed by place cells that were active on the first day of the experiment, day 5, and then we can ask, what did these cells did on other days of the experiment? And we see that many of the cells were not necessarily active on all days of the experiment, but cells that were active on more than one day typically retained their preferred firing position. And this is not something that is unique to the first day of the experiment. We can take as reference the map that was formed on day 20 in the middle of the experiment, and we see this build-up and then fading of that specific representation. And importantly, this is not the disappearance of the code. This is a time-dependent change to the spatial code of the linear track. And this representational drift has since been shown by other groups and using other techniques in different brain areas. However, this experiment did not explicitly assess memory performance, and so it remains unclear what is the relationship between place code stability and long-term spatial memory. So to address this question, Noa Sadeh from our lab trained mice to navigate in an 8-hour maze to a fixed location in which a reward was given. So specifically, and on each trial, Noa placed the mouse at the end of one of the 7 start arms, and using distal visual cues, mice learned to navigate to the goal arm. And mice were trained on this task for 5 consecutive days, and were then divided into 2 groups. The recent group had a recall session 10 days after the end of learning, and the remote group had a recall session a month after the end of learning, and that is the 6th session, and there was another session, additional one, 1 day after learning. So we can see an example movie from the first day of the experiment, and the mouse is still not familiarized with the maze, so you can see it's kind of like trying to understand what's going on. And importantly, this is a spatial reference task, so the hippocampus here is needed both during acquisition and during retrieval. And shortly, we will see a glimpse from an example trial from day 5, in which the mouse knows this experiment by heart. So we can see the mouse runs straight from the start arm to the goal arm. So overall, when we look at the behavioral performance, we see that it improves with time, as quantified here by the number of errors that the mouse makes on each session. And then memory performance is slightly impaired during a recent recall and markedly impaired during remote recall. And now we can look at single cells, and what we find is that this improving behavioral performance is accompanied by a refinement of the spatial code. And specifically, we can look at the example of this one cell that I'm showing you here for the first 5 days of the experiment. And we can see that on day 1, that this cell is active on different location on the maze. And by the time we get to day 5, this place cell has formed a more refined place field. We can ask, how does this place field look 1 month after? During this month, the mouse has not visited the maze, yet the cell has retained its preferred firing position. Now, when we look at the entire population, as expected, we find heterogeneity in the response. So we find more single cells similar to the one I just showed you that maintain the same preferred firing position. But we also find cells that underwent this refinement process with learning, but did not maintain the same preferred position. And consistent with this refinement that we see in single cells, we also find that the amount of information that each individual cell carry about the mice position increase with time. And you can see this by the increase in information distribution of the population across the learning days, as you see by this shift to the right of the distribution. And we also trained the decoder to infer mouse position on each day. And we find that decoding accuracy improved with learning, and as you can see by this shift in the data points to the left. It was also correlated with the behavioral performance, namely the number of errors that the mouse made. And even when we control for the effect of time, we find that behavioral performance is correlated with the decoder accuracy. So this suggests that the better the neuronal code, the better the mouse performs on this task. And we can also look at the recall session. And we find that during a recent recall session, that is 10 days after the end of learning, we find that the information levels are similar to the ones that were observed at the end of learning, as we can see by comparing the information distributions between day 15, recent recall, and day 5, the end of learning. However, when we look at remote recall, we see that there was a sharp decrease in information level in the remote group. And we can also see this per mouse. We can see this increase in information with learning, and then this sharp decrease in information during remote recall. So overall, these results suggest that memory performance is correlated with place code quality. Now, given what I've shown you earlier about place code stability, we now ask, what is the relationship between memory performance and place code stability? So in order to do that, we calculated the population vector correlation, and this matrices summarize the result. So each entry in this matrix is the similarity between the spatial code between each 2 days of the experiment. And we can now look at all the pairs of consecutive sessions, namely this secondary diagonal, and it's also summarized here or visualized here to your right. And we can see that despite the fact that within the first 4 pairs of subsequent sessions, the behavioral performance improves, we find that the representation of the maze continues to change at a similar rate. And we see it here. And we see that this effect is even more pronounced with the time. Specifically, we see this decrease in similarity during recent recall, and an even sharper decrease following the month up to remote recall. And now I'm showing you again the behavioral results. And I'm showing you this because I want you to see that there is variability both in the behavioral performance and in the stability of the code. And so we asked, could it be that mice that better performed the task also had a more stable code? And we found that that is the answer is yes for the recent group. So we see that if the code was more stable, namely a higher population vector correlation, that is a greater similarity between the map that was formed on day 5 to the map that was formed on day 15, the lower the difference in the number of errors that the mouse made. However, we did not find such a correlation for the remote group. And I will just mention in short that we've used another measure for spatial similarity, that is tuning curve correlation between pairs of cells that were active on both sessions, and we get the same result. Again, we see this change in representation throughout learning that is time dependent, that is greater for recent recall and then for remote recall. And we find a correlation between spatial similarity or spatial stableness of similarity and the change in the number of errors that the mouse makes. And we don't find that correlation for the remote group. So overall, these results suggest that remote memory performance does not correlate with place code stability. Now, this lack of correlation is surprising, but I want to mention that it is not due to the hippocampus being disengaged during remote recall. And we can see that we do find correlation between the amount of information the population possesses or carries during remote recall and the behavioral performance during remote recall. And we also found correlation between the change in information between the last day of learning and remote recall and the change in the number of errors that the mouse makes. So overall, this again suggests that memory performance is correlated with place code quality, namely the informativeness of the code. So as I mentioned earlier, mice had an additional session on day 16 for the recent group and day 34 for the remote group. And I'm going to compare now the results between this day and the last day of learning. So we see that behaviorally, during the session, the number of errors were, or the behavioral performance returned to the levels as they were at the end of learning. And we see a similar thing with information. We see that the information during this 7th session returned to the level that it was at the end of learning. Now, if the map that was formed at day 5, the end of learning, is now stored as a set of stable attractor, we would expect that during this session, there would be a reconvergence to the previously established map. And this reconvergence would result in an increase in similarity between session 7 and session 5 relative to session 6 and session 5, the recall session and the end of learning. However, we don't find such an increase, not for the population vector correlation and not for the tuning curve correlation, and we don't see it for both groups. So overall, it doesn't seem to be the case, even when the behavioral performance bounced back to what it previously was and the information level returned to the level that there was, the map is not, does not reconverge to a previous version of itself. And one last thing, mice in the research group that were exposed to the maze on days 15 and 16 were also re-exposed to the maze on days 33 and 34, and this time point will be marked in gray. Comparing this time point and the end of learning will now be shown in gray. So we see that behaviorally, during this remote re-exposure, behavioral performance were similar to the ones that were observed during recent recall and were similar to the ones at the end of learning and significantly different than behavioral performance during remote recall. We also see that the information levels here remained high and similar to the ones observed during recent recall and different than the ones observed during remote recall. However, when we look at the stability, and here I added the extra sessions to population vector matrices that you saw before, we can now compare between the recent recall, remote recall, and remote re-exposure recall to the map that was formed at the end of learning. And what we find is that the map that was formed during remote re-exposure was not more similar to the map that was formed at the end of learning relative to the map that was formed during remote recall. And it was significantly different than the map that was formed during recent recall. So overall, these results suggest that despite the fact that this additional experience in the arena helped retain neural code quality and memory performance, it did not stabilize the representation of the map. And with that, I would like to summarize. So I've shown you today that long-term spatial memory is maintained in the presence of ongoing changes in hippocampal representations. Somewhat inconsistent with prevailing notions, our results suggest that stability of hippocampal place code is not a prerequisite for persistent remote memory. And we think that our results point to a population-level organization that enables retention of learned information despite ongoing changes at the single-cell level. With that, I would like to thank Noa Sadeh, Alon Rubin. We had a recent baby boom in the lab, so our families, Yaniv Ziv, Daniel Ditch was very helpful, and the entire Ziv lab. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meytar. These are beautiful data and a wonderful analysis linking place code stability to memory metrics, and it has sparked a lot of questions. So working through them quickly, Denise Kai asks, do you think the lack of PV correlation with memory performance is because the memory has been systems consolidated to cortex, or do they just forget?
Okay, so let's talk about the system consolidation first, and then about the just forget, because these are two different answers. So regarding system consolidation, so in system consolidation, we think that the hippocampus is important during learning, but then may become disengaged during retrieval. However, the task that we use requires, or similar, this task type we know that it depends on the hippocampus during acquisition as well. So I don't think this is the case. We also have data from prefrontal cortical areas, and we also see a representational drift there. So we have a lot to talk about when it comes to system consolidation, but I will focus on the hippocampus data now. When it comes to forgetting, they don't just forget. We see both behaviorally and neuronally that there is still some similarity to the code that was present at the end of learning. So the mice do not fully forget. But I guess the next part of this question, I'm sorry, if you want to, we can move to other questions.
Carry on quick. Yes, I want to make sure we get to other questions, but finish your thought there, please.
No, because it's going to be long, because then I think what Denise asked is then what is stable? So what persists?
Right. Bigger question. Okay, more discussion to be had. Rishika Mohanta asks a technical question about how you account for position drift in the imaging setup over multiple days. Is it through image alignment, and what are the landmarks used if it's through image alignment?
Okay, so that is a very important question. So if I understand correctly, he's asking about the way that we align for the field of view?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So this is a super important question. It's a super important question for our work. And it's such an important question that Liron Scheintuch from our lab in 2017 published the method that we are currently using, and I will give you an intuition about what it is. So first of all, this is a method for automatically align and register cells in a probabilistic way that gives us also a confidence mark of how confident are we that we're recording from the same cells. It also allows us to discard data if we find that it's not aligned properly. So generally, we assume, or not assume, we know that cells maintain their position in the field of view, and they also maintain their shape, as you can see here by this alignment of 3 different sessions from day 1, 2, and 33. And you see this, so this is just an RGB alignment. So you see that they just fall on top of each other. I want to show you just one more figure, and with that I will finish my answer to that question. And that is, this is another field of view from this experiment from days 5 and 33. And we can mark individual cells here. And we can take, for example, this one cell, and we can say that we're pretty certain that it is the same cell across the days 5 and 33. However, when we look at the tuning curve correlation of this specific cell, we can see that this cell has changed his preferred firing position across the month between the end of learning and remote recall session. So it's not that the lack of stability is due to not tracking the same cells.
Wonderful. I'm going to give you excellent. I'm going to give you so much enthusiasm here. I'm going to try to get a couple combined here. Oliver Barnstedt and Victor Pedroza, in my mind, are asking a similar question. Did the number of place cells change with time while the place cells are being refined? That's from Victor. And Oliver says, do you see an overrepresentation of place fields in the goal arm? And if so, is there a correlation with retrieval performance?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll start with the second one. That's a great question. We haven't quantified yet the possible overrepresentation of place cells in the goal arm. And as for the number of place cells, so it varies across days. So we have like this range of place cells, but I don't remember the exact number. But I do think, but generally, a possible change in the number of place cells is not. Okay. What I'm trying to say, the decoding result that I've shown you previously was done not only on place cells, but on the entire population. So when we talk about the informative of the population, we don't only rely on specific changes in the number of place cells that were observed. But I don't have the exact number of place cells in front of me right now.
Excellent. There are so many more questions, unfortunately, including mine. So we're going to have to switch, though, to the next talk. And so, Meytar, please hang around and chat with people. You've generated a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about your work. Thank you so much. We're going to switch now.